But what I'm going to talk about tonight is the Utah War of 1857 and look at it from an archaeological standpoint. And it's quite the unique place Fort Bridger is. And we have been working at Fort Bridger since 1983. We've been doing excavation here, and there's more to it than meets the eye. Right here is a drawing of 1850 of Jim Bridger's trading post that's on the Black's Fork River. And it's actually what would be Pleistocene gravel terraces, or it'd be one of these areas where you have braided stream systems. So it was between multiple streams in southwestern Wyoming. And up until 1843, you couldn't live in this place because it was covered with water. 1843 is about the end of the last little ice age. It had manifestations here in Arizona, had manifestations throughout the West. It was wetter, moisture, cooler. And so Fort Bridger couldn't be settled until after 1843, but it was ideal for raising cattle. And it set astride the Oregon Trail. Now, Jim Bridger picked this on purpose so that he could actually serve people that were going west to Oregon. And from 1843 to 1847, primarily people that were leaving the eastern United States were going to Oregon. There was very few coming into this area. There were some coming into New Mexico, not really very much at all. So Oregon was a point of destination, and this happened to be on a bend in the Oregon Trail. The fastest way across the United States was to go over South Pass. It was flat and even across. Is there a way I can advance this? Yeah. Okay. So I will. There we go. So this is Fort Bridger in the winter. And everybody says that Wyoming has winter 365 days out of the year. The whole joke is that there was a sociologist came to study the people who lived here, and they asked him, what do you do for entertainment in the summer? They says, well, if it comes on the weekend, we get together to play baseball. So it's perpetual winter. And this is Bridger's trading post in the winter. It was not occupied in the winter, which is kind of an interesting thing. And winter starts about now. Between now and in May, it's cold. It's cold and it's moist. So Bridger was a seasonal trading post, and he hid a lot of his stuff in the floor. So what he would do is like the old trappers would do, he'd dig holes, and he'd catch his goods for the year that he wanted to sell next year. He'd put it in a hole, cover it with straw, put dirt on top of it, run the horses over it, and then he'd leave. So technically the trading post was not occupied 365 days of the year, but it was significant, which I'll show you in a minute. It was built in 1843. And it was built out of rough hewn wood, and it was built out of pine trees that were to the south. There was cottonwood and willow at this place, but cottonwood and willow do not hold up well under construction. So they brought pine trees from the south and the Uinta Mountains. This particular map right here shows the location of, and I've got to be careful with this. This is the point, yes. Shows the location of major trail system through here. This is the National Park Service trail system, and these are congressional national trails. The one down here to the south comes down through the southern part of the state, and it comes over to Southern California. But this is the one that we're going to focus on, which they call the Central Trails. In 1843, it had very little traffic. They would go on through here up to the Dalles and into Oregon, and then up around current Portland and Portland in the Willamette Valley, and then they go south. When this comes up and these pop up, I can't see what I'm looking at. So thank you. It was built to serve westward bound travelers and traders, and it was pretty important. The three major trails that came through here were the Oregon, California Pioneer Trail and the Mormon Trail, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. No, it's not advancing. Can this advance? In slides aren't advancing. Sorry. I might have to stand over here where I can. It's not advancing. There we go. Goods were freighted across the plains by wagons or pack trains from places like Fort Leavenworth to Bridges Trading Post, and most of these goods began their voyage by steamships like the Arabia. Now I'm going to talk about the Arabia specifically, so there's more than just this, but they would come to places like Fort Leavenworth right here. They would offload, and then they would take the trip west, and Bridger would get his own freight goods. But primarily, these are the routes across the plains. The plains are pretty smooth. When you get to this particular area, you have different issues. I'm going to stop and pause right here for a second to talk about westward travel in general. According to UNRU, every 200 feet from St. Joseph, Missouri, from Kansas City, there would be a fatality. So every 200 feet, there's a grave. From the eastern part of the states, I'm sorry, this is not working. From the eastern part of the states, most of the people died of smallpox, cholera, typhoid, and other things. Once they got to South Pass in this area here that I was starting to describe, they died of chemical dysentery. But every 200 feet, there was a grave along this particular trail. From St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, and on up to the Willamette Valley, there were quite a few people that died. It was a tough trip across here. Goods were freighted across the plains by wagon, and as I mentioned, they were brought by Arabia. And then when they got to places like the Platte River or they got to the Missouri River, they were freighted across. I'm not going to read this to you. You can take the opportunity to read across this, but the most dangerous thing that they faced was crossing the rivers and diseases. More people died from accidental gunshots than were ever killed by Native Americans. And more people died from drowning than were ever killed by Native Americans too. So crossing the rivers was a major problem. And in places like the Green River, in places like the Missouri, they had to come across in ferries and they had to freight themselves across. When they came to the Platte River, which was in present Wyoming, when they came to the Green River, they had to ferry across. And who took control of these but mountain men? Mountain men controlled the ferries. So people like Jim Bridger made his money by trading goods to the people that were going west. And he also made money by ferrying people across. And it became quite lucrative. In terms of the Latter-day Saints, they came west in 1847 because they were trying to avoid persecution in the east. They were persecuted first at Kirtland, second in southeastern Missouri, and then lastly at Nauvoo. At Nauvoo, they set up their kingdom in about 1839. And between 1839 and 1846, there were 1,925 deaths of Latter-day Saints because of persecution and because of intemperate weather. Part of the problem is they were forced, especially at Nauvoo, to live in what would be called marginalized land. And that marginalized land caused a high number of deaths. Because of the persecution of the Latter-day Saints in Kirtland and in Clay County, Missouri, and then later at Nauvoo, they came west to Utah to find sanctuary. So in migrating to Utah, their idea was to come west and get away from all of the persecution in the east. And they set up on winter quarters along the Missouri River at a place called near Omaha, Nebraska, and began their journey west. In the end, they established the state of Utah. Now, Utah is an established state, is a pretty unique state in and of itself. So I'm going to stop, slow down, go back to certain things. The first migration was to Oregon, 1843, to go back to that point. The second major migration was 1847, with the Latter-day Saints coming west to avoid persecution in the east. And then the main one was 1849 in the gold rush to California. In the end, in 1849, 1850, they say 50,000 people went over South Pass. This was combined with Latter-day Saints. Now, what's real intriguing about this is once they established the kingdom in Missouri, when the Latter-day Saints established their kingdom in Missouri, they had to go back and get goods. They brought individuals across to settle in Utah. They had to go back and get freight goods. There was constant traffic along this road, and Jim Bridger, sitting at Fort Bridger, was making a killing. He was making a very good high profit. What he would do is he'd take one tired ox or one tired horse, and they were trading 3 tired horses or 2 tired oxes for one healthy ox that he had raised there. He had 300 cattle there in 1857, and he made his money from trading with these people that are going west. The freighters that came east and west along this trail through here needed new horses all the way along this place. And so having a trading post astride this major east-west corridor made you have the opportunity to have wealth. So he built it up pretty well. And by 1853, tensions over Jim Bridger selling alcohol to Native Americans led to the then Indian agent and governor of Utah Territory, Brigham Young, to have Jim Bridger arrested. Utah Territory was established, and it was quite expansive. But the people that ran the ferries and the people that ran the trading posts competed with the idea of how these people would make their money in the West, and that was with trading with westward travelers. So by 1853, he had been there for 10 years. There was tension that occurred. So he sold alcohol to the Native Americans. So Jim Bridger was had a warrant for his arrest to be arrested for selling alcohol to the Indians at his trading post. Well, he sold it to more than just Native Americans. But he had this warrant for his arrest, and they sent a posse to arrest him at his trading post. When that posse arrived, his wife, who was a Native American, helped him escape into the willows, and he wasn't captured. The person that was sent to capture him wrote to Brigham Young and says, "We have captured the trading post and taken it over. And we've destroyed the alcohol dose by dose, so much so that the posse can't perform their duties." So it was a different day, different time, different space. Lewis Robinson, who was in charge of this, essentially in charge of Green River County, Utah Territory, which included Jim Bridger's trading post, seized Bridger's goods, and the list of what he had to sell from his trading post was diverse. So you can't read this completely through here, but he sold lead, he sold bullets, he sold all kinds of things. And another one of the manifests where they seized his goods, it said that he sold that he had a can of lobster. In other words, anything that you could have in the East, you could have in the West, if you could get it by freight train there. But the principal thing that he sold was gunpowder, lead, blankets and knives, etc., like this. He also sold a craft that he had, and that was being a blacksmith. One of the principal things that he did was repair wagons. You couldn't go and get a tire repaired at Big O. You couldn't go into some other place and get your wagon fixed. You had to have a blacksmith fix it. And he set up a blacksmith shop. The three most lucrative things that he had there were the cattle, the blacksmith shop, and the trade items such as powder, lead, rifles, iron, and blankets. His Native American wives also helped make profits there because they made moccasins and they made blankets. And it wasn't just his wives, there was other trappers and traders that were there. In fact, by 1843, there were probably about 13 structures around his trading post of different traders, and most of them were married to Native American women. And Native American women were the way that you could make more money in several different ways. In fact, one person, Joel Palmer, wrote that trappers or their wives, their Native American wives, were the principal traders at this post. When you think about it, there's three things that are going to happen. Number one, you're going to run out of supplies, flour, etc., like this. Number two, your tires and everything on your wagon are going to break down and you're not going to be able to get them repaired without a blacksmith shop. And the thing that we don't think about very often is that you're walking. You're not riding necessarily in the wagon west. Your shoes are going to wear out. And these Native Americans made moccasins and made shoes, and they repaired shoes at this particular place. So they had a fairly lucrative industry that was going here. What happened is when they sold this place, you can see this up here, it doesn't show up well in this slide, but they're selling gun and powder and lead. What happens in this particular case is that they're running a business that's a necessity and much needed. The church at this particular period of time, the Latter-day Saints, decided that what they wanted to do was have control of the territory that they lived in. And one of the things that was keeping them from having that was Jim Bridger's post. So when Bridger fled, there was bad blood. Despite the trading post being sold by him and his partner to the Latter-day Saints for a total of $8,000 in 1855, Jim Bridger claimed to his dying day that the Latter-day Saints stole and burned his property. Specifically, he blamed Brigham Young for stealing his property. The 1855 bill of sale does add in the church paid for 100 head of cattle, $30 each or $3,000, and they paid for 7 heads of horse, $30 each, $210. That doesn't include everything that was there. Later on, he is paid $6,000 by the U.S. government because of what's about to happen in just a moment. Established 9 miles south of Fort Bridger in 1843, the Latter-day Saints built Fort Supply to compete with Fort Bridger. So you have two forts. You have Fort Bridger and you have Fort Supply. So in 53, you have Fort Bridger and Fort Supply, and Supply becomes a very large site. Here they can grow wheat, they can grow barley, they can grow oats, they can sell that to people traveling through. They can provide food and sustenance. And I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. It's kind of not the best thing to do. George A. Smith, who visited Fort Supply in April 1856, reported Fort Supply enclosed an area of about 10 acres and a stockade built by setting a double row of pickets 18 feet long and about 1 foot through and pointed at the top into the ground 6 foot deep. The workmanship of the stockade is seen in the bastions and the 2-story house used as a courthouse and other public purposes. Fort Supply became the county seat of Green River County, Utah, and it had 25 neatly constructed dwellings and substantially made corrals and stockyards. It was a large fort. It was 9 miles by horse from Fort Bridger to Fort Supply. So you have these two forts that are here. Well, this is not the only place that they're building fort. Now, this is Utah territory. If you look at the extent of it, it's to the top of the Continental Divide, all the way out to the edge of the Great Basin, back down in this viewpoint, and then taking it to the top part of northern Arizona. We would be in Utah territory at this point in time. as would Fredonia in what they call the Arizona Strip that goes towards Colorado City. Now, that dividing line is very difficult to know. Here at this point is Cedar City, and Cedar City had two forts built beside it in 1854. Fort Harmony, which is just off the interstate there. You go through Harmony. If you're going between Cedar City and St. George, you have Fort Harmony, and then a little bit to the west of St. George, you have Fort Santa Clara. So you have Fort Santa Clara. These are built in 1854. Why? The persecution in the West had taught them that they needed to protect themselves. So they were building fortifications to protect themselves from outsiders. There was a great fear of the outsiders because they'd been attacked at Kirtland, they'd been attacked in Missouri, they'd been attacked at Nauvoo. Their prophet was killed in Illinois. In the construction of these forts right here, the principal person right here at Fort Harmony was a man by the name of John D. Lee. John D. Lee is the famous Ferry Lee, and that was to be incorporated with inside of Utah territory, because if you get the idea of what's happening here, they have ferries here, they have ferries up on the Green River, and people have to cross through them. They say that only 5% of the people we'll go back to this date that I just gave you a second ago, the 5% of the people in 1853 to 1855 could swim in the United States. It wasn't something that you took with swimming lessons. Worst part of it is you get to the Colorado River, and even though the Colorado River is warm down here, when you swim across it, you still run the risk of hypothermia being swept away. The ferries were the safest way across. Further north, in the Platte, in the Green Rivers, the rivers were so cold that hypothermia killed a lot of individuals, and people's lives were lost constantly. So by the church controlling the ferries, and by their members controlling the ferries, they could send money to Salt Lake City and could help expand the state, could help expand the state. And so therefore, these were contributing areas. Fort Harmony built in 54 by John D. Lee, Fort Santa Clara built in 55 to 62. While Fort Supply is being built and Fort Bridger is being purchased, two other forts not far from Mountain Meadows, where a famous thing happens in 1857, and I'll get to in a moment, where these forts are constructed. Fort Bridger is turned into a stone fortification in 1857. That wood structure that I showed you here had the walls torn down, the picket walls torn down, but the main structures inside of it, like Jim Bridger's house, Vasquez's house, the trading post, and possibly the blacksmith shop, are left intact. The blacksmith shop is too important for the finances of the fort for it to be torn down, but they build the stone structure out of river cobbles. It's quite impressive. This is the drawing of the Latter-day Saint fort in 1857 at Fort Bridger. Notice the Native Americans around it. They also set up a Shoshone mission at Fort Supply. There were over 400 Native Americans living in this area. Native Americans liked this area because it was a great place to winter. Large animals like buffalo and elk. The buffalo were being hunted out by the 50s, but buffalo and elk and deer would come down here in winter. So it was a great place to live. It had great pastures. And that also was accommodating to the cattle that were in this area, especially for people going west. In 1857, James Buchanan sent troops to Utah to remove Brigham Young as governor. Why he did this is multifaceted. And you can go down a rabbit hole and look at the whys and wherefores of what occurred. But essentially what he did was order Brigham Young to step down, and that he would be replaced by Alfred Cummings. As a result, people died at the Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1857. 120 people were killed. Because why is that troops were already marching from Fort Leavenworth to help install Alfred Cummings as the new territorial governor. I'll get to this bottom point down here. So 120 people killed at Mountain Meadows, not too far from Fort Harmony and not too far from Fort Santa Clara. And John D. Lee went from Harmony, and he was one of the leaders of the killing of these immigrants that were coming through. I don't want to go through the whys and wherefores. I just want to say that this is something that occurred at this particular point in time. In addition, as a result, people died at Mountain Meadows, and men like Richard Yates were executed for selling powder to the military. Richard Yates, who lived at Bridger's Fort before Jim Bridger sold the place, sold powder to the army as they came west. Now, 2,500 men are coming west. They have they have the infantry, they have the 2nd Dragoons, they have cannons. They're coming to set up Alfred Cummings as governor. They thought that Brigham Young resisted. Conversely, Brigham Young had seen his prophet get killed, not visually, but he had helped bury his prophet in Nauvoo. He feared that they were coming to kill him. It set this tension in 1857 that could not be overcome among the people there. As the Army sent to install Alfred Cummings as the new territorial governor advanced west from Fort Leavenworth, Army supplies trains were burned. The idea was to burn everything of use so the Army could have no food or shelter. So they burned everything that was coming. They burned all the grass so the animals wouldn't have anything to eat. They burned the supply trains. The tragedy of this, and I've got to be careful not to go down rabbit holes. I've been studying this since 1983, and the last year all I've done is read books about this particular thing. So I've got to be careful about going down the rabbit hole in this particular case. But the thing about it is that by burning the grass, that they thought that they could kill the animals. Well, this was supplemented by the fact that the winter was so bad. But what they burned were supply trains that belonged to private contractors. And those private contractors lost their wealth because they didn't get the money until the Army paid for it. The Army wasn't going to pay for burned supplies. But in effect, what it did was slow down the military. What the Latter-day Saints did not have was black powder. Yates selling black powder to the military was tantamount to treason in their mind. So they executed him. There were others that died. It was not a bloodless war. In 1857, from October 1st to the 14th, Fort Supply, Fort Bridger, and other structures in the area were burned. Now, in all of this that I'm telling you, from 53 to 57, there had been a great deal of construction, and it turned into a pretty profitable enterprise. According to Latter-day Saint records, $300,000 were lost in 2 or 3 days. They burned $300,000 worth of goods. So when they burned these structures down, and it was the end of basically the Latter-day Saints in that particular area. Not completely. They would come back and they're still, I mean, they would return to the area and they're still there today. There is a lot of contestation about it. They said Jim Bridger sold him the fort. Bridger said he didn't sell him the fort. There were spoliation claims. But as a result of the Utah War, the military made Fort Bridger and Supply City and Fort Supply part of a military reservation. And because of eminent domain, it was then their property. When the military wants to take your property, you don't have any questions. It's theirs. It's eminent domain, and they took it. So from that point forward, the land has belonged to somebody else, even though they purchased it, even though they claimed it, even though they built the area up. They lost it in one week in October. The intriguing thing about this is that this leaves an archaeological record. So this is what some people see as boring, but I see as absolutely fascinating. This is 1843. You see this layer right here? Yeah. That's 1843. This is 1847. And I know this because of the fact that they burned down one of the blacksmith shop and it left the sashings here. And this is the burn from 1857 when Latter-day Saints burned it. And this is 1858. This line across here is 1858 and it goes to 1888. This right here, from here to here is 1890. This from here to it's from 1890 to the present. You see a little deposition. Now, from an archaeological standpoint, the interesting thing about this is all inside of Jim Bridger's post. So you want to live on a flat floor, so they level it. So when they level it to live on in 43, then after the fire of 47, they level it. And then after the fire of 1857, they basically level it. And the military comes in and just levels this place across. So they have a flat place to leave. They pull out all the beams and all the timbers of all the structures that burned inside this stone fort that they had built. And it's a beautiful stone fort. It's 100 feet by 100 feet. And it's 50 feet by 100 feet by 80 feet for the corral. So they have a stone corral and they have a stone fort that they've constructed there. The stones don't burn. They get scored and they get scorched, but they don't burn. The buildings fall to the ground and all the artifacts are there. These are the structures that we know they have burned. They have burned inside the corral, which is to the north. And I'll show this in different ways. They burned the stable area, and we're not sure what these two buildings are here, but they burned these buildings here. We think that this is where the animals were at, because based on the artifacts that we can find. They burned the trading post, which both Jim Bridger and the Latter-day Saints had. The difference between the Latter-day Saint trading post and Jim Bridger's floor was dirt, and theirs was wood. So they actually put in wooden floors through here. And when you get to, I'll show you burned wooden floor in a minute. When you get to the wooden floors, you pull up the wooden floors, and there's Jim Bridger's stuff down below it. Below the wooden floor, there's an 1853 half dime. So we know specifically it dates that. No, you don't use coins to date a site. You have to have a lot of coins. But this is pretty intriguing. They burned Vasquez's house, who is Jim Bridger's partner. Now, there's a lot of this stuff that I'm dancing through to get to these other points. They burned Bridger's house and a milk storage facility here. That milk storage facility here was built by the Latter-day Saints. It was built down to the groundwater. They could store milk and cheese in there. These structures here were built by Bridger. These structures here are built by the Latter-day Saints, and they put a blacksmith shop in here. There used to be a blacksmith shop in the main part. So this is the main part of the building. I'll come to this in a minute. This is the main part of the fortification. This is the corral, and that's kind of important to keep separate. This right here is an 1888 barracks, and they built the barracks right on top of the old fort. Now that creates a problem for us in doing the archaeology because it covers up the stuff. We should tear it down, except it's the modern museum. We should tear it down and see what we can find. But this is pretty interesting. This is the Latter-day Saint west wall for their structure that they built. This is the inside of the trading post in here. The trading post is right here. This is the milk trench. And this is one of those places where I told you that he catch hides and he put food in and he trampled over the top of it so that he could hide it while he was gone. This is one of those cache pits that are right here that we found. This is the corral area. This is the west stone wall for the corral. This right here is the north wall for the corral. And this right here is a military structure. The military came in and built structures here in 57 when they took over the place. They began to build new model structures. This here is an artistic rendition of where Jim Bridger's northern picket wall was. To build a lot of the things that they wanted, they pulled out these picket walls. They're probably deteriorating. Pulled out the picket walls and then expanded it. I think that it's a little bit off that probably the picket wall is right here for where his northern wall for his corral was. But this would have been Jim Bridger's corral. So this is an artistic rendition here. This is the west wall of the structure right there. Latter-day Saint western corral wall, Bridger's corral wall just slightly to the north of where it's right there. This is the north wall of the Latter-day Saint corral. That still stands. That was built in 1857. And I'm skipping through this a little bit, but they built this entire stone fort in 1 year and made it out of these river cobbles. And they cemented it with mortar that they made in kilns to the east. So they created this beautiful cemented structure here. So this is the north wall of the corral. Inside that area, we found these pipes. This is a burned pipe. This is adhering sand. When this heated up, it became a little bit fluid. It became liquid a little bit. The pipe became a little liquid, and the sand had annealed to it. But this is an example of a burned item. Most pipes don't look like this. This is a calumet pipe that was inside the Bridger's trading post right there. This was from Minnesota. This red calamite is basically from Minnesota. We can do trace element analysis on it and pin it to Minnesota. But this was an item traded to the Native Americans. They traded with other Native Americans for items that the Native Americans would like, and they traded for this. This is a cork inside of a bottle. You could get anything you wanted at Jim Bridger's trading post and at the Latter-day Saint trading post because the freight wagons went right by your door. And what the heck? You got a large load, you're tired of it, your horses are tired. You say, you give me $20, I'll give you this item. They say, oh, sure. We don't have to take it all the way to Sacramento. We'll sell it wherever we can sell it. Now, some of that stuff was consigned, but the idea was that you could buy anything that's here. Because of the fire, the nick on this bottle broke. But I really do like the fact that the cork is still in the bottle. What's in the bottle, I can't say. Probably it's wine. It's probably not beer. Beer is a little bit different. Beer bottles weren't that common. The Deseret News in 1857, this is before the war breaks out, before all of these things take place. Okay, Mountain Meadows occurs early September, but after this article comes out, this is September the 2nd. And in there they talk about freight wagons are constantly passing back and forth. And you can see arrived August 31st, the freight train of Monsieur Stewart and Bowman. They constantly were putting in the paper that these freight wagons were arriving into Salt Lake Valley. They would bring you anything that you wanted. The manifest for the steamship Arabia that sank near Kansas City on September 5th, 1856 indicates thousands of items of all kinds went west in 1857, and the freight wagons with these goods bound for Salt Lake City passed through or near Fort Bridger. These items are left in the archaeological record. And you can go and actually see the complete item because when this ship sank, it was sealed and there was no air got into it. And you should go visit this if you have any interest in 1856. This steamship Arabia is completely sealed. Everything is perfectly preserved. The leather, the cloth, they've taken and cleaned the cloth, and it would look as good as your sweater because some of that stuff is wool. What they did find out, though, is that it being buried deep underneath the water and being sealed like that was cotton rots. It doesn't stand up. Silk lasts. Silk and wool last for quite some time. But the point is that these items made it all the way west. This right here is a perfume bottle. This perfume bottle with this stopper. We found this stopper in our excavation inside the corral. So you can see the glass stopper. You can take the items that we find at Fort Bridger, take it like to the Arabia steamship, compare the items and see exactly what we've got, even though we only had bits and pieces. Because when the fire came, it crushed a lot of stuff. Very little, few things were left whole. Most things are in pieces. So we have to put together the pieces. How many items were there left? 110,000 items in the one place that I showed you where that one excavation was. So that's quite a few. In this area right here, we've not quite got the count on it, but we think that we have 70,000 items in the northern corral area. So this is just from the corral area right here. Pieces of pipes were found throughout it. So in the units that date from 1853 to 1858, we find nothing but piped bottles like this. I'll not be able to have the time to show you, but for example, we find a pipe with Buchanan's head on the front of it. So instead of giving out a pin, and say, I'm voting for Buchanan, you got a pipe that had his face. So you could remember what his face looked like. I mean, it wasn't that a good looking face, but it was a face that you could remember. And you remember that that's the person to vote for. And if it was free, what the heck. We found bone lice combs. And I'm going to pause on this right here. We found bone lice combs. Those bone lice combs are on the Arabia. This particular bone lice comb is very interesting because the fact that it is made out of cranial cap. How we know this is because it's curved. And what you'd want on that comb is for it to be curved, but it's curved with a bone. Now you can soak bone and make it curved, but if you can get it where it's thin, you've got it. So it's like from a coyote or a dog or a wolf, and then they put these thin teeth. You run the teeth through the hair. It has to be real thin to get the lice out of it. So they pull the lice out of the hair, and it's a constant thing. It's not something we should think about tonight when we go to sleep, but the lice are coming in that particular period of time. We found these pearl buttons. Now, there are other kind of buttons. There's countless number of military buttons, but these pearl buttons are within that area that was burned inside of the corral. This is but a small number of them. The problem with the pearl buttons is that when they get heated, they have a tendency to be very friable. Retrieving them from the archaeological excavation is difficult with them having them fall apart. But they had pearl buttons. In 1853, in that manifest that I showed you that you couldn't read because of the fact that the lighting is what it is, in that 1853 manifest, Lewis Robinson sees 25 pounds of assorted trade beads from Bridger's trading post, valued at $1 a pound. On the Arabia, they have those same items that are there, but they were beautiful trade beads. These beads were made in Venice because of the fact that they have high soda content in it. And what you can do, don't do this at home, is take and crush these beads and look for them to see if they have soda ash in it. Potash is from Flanders and from Northern Europe. Soda ash is from Venice. Venice dominated the trade beads situation. From the Latter-day Saints trading post, 1,397 trade beads were found in the initial archaeological excavation. Just on that floor, we found 1,397 inside the trading post floor. Because one thing, you're going to drop them, and it's hard enough with double screening to find these beads. It's very difficult to find these beads. Some of these trade beads were found directly on the burned planks inside the Latter-day Saints trading post. This trading post was burned in advance of the U.S. Army's advance in 1857, as you know. This is photographed as the top of the burned floor found during archaeological excavations. Even if this picture was the best picture you could see, it's very difficult to see the planking on it. But it was really cool because the fact you could say, okay, this is after the Latter-day Saints came in because they put in a sawmill down at Supply City. So they had planking, so they could put the planking inside of it. So this comes after 1853. This comes before 1853. And you pull up the burned plank, and there's Jim Bridger's life story. Not quite, but there it is right underneath the bottom of it. Trade beads like the ones shown here from the Arabia that were being shipped west in 1856 came in all colors and shapes. This, in a job that I had this last year, drove me crazy. I'd never seen green beads. I'd never seen these kind of pink beads. But yes, they're there. Problem with Fort Bridger, why you couldn't tell the pinks, is because of the fact that most of them had been heated up. So it changed the properties. Whatever was in the pink dye that was making that glass, that we had a little bit of trouble identifying that pink in the archaeological excavation. The variety of beads found in excavation at Bridger's Fort shows the variation in size and shape of beads. Both the Latter-day Saints trading post and Jim Bridger's trading post had variation. This, some people call a Padre bead, but you see how deep blue that is? That has to be later. That has to be from, I think, from the 1850s. I might be wrong. This is a faceted bead right here. Like in the African bead trade, most of the beads in North America are manufactured in Venice, with some from Northern Europe. Based on the archaeological excavation at Fort Bridger, we know that many beads were worked and traded in 1857. That's something that's kind of intriguing. So this is the location of the beads. This is a drawing of Bridger's the Latter-day Saint trading post. And this was drawn in June of 1858. And the guy that did it was a really good little artist. But he kind of excluded some of the things. These buildings, however, here were built by the military. They built 7 structures inside this stone wall. And in addition to that, they put in, see the cannons out here, they put in lunettes at each end of it so that they could have cannon mounts on the outside of it. The beads found elsewhere in Wyoming, sorry about this right here. These are what they look like on Native American sites where they're out in the plains or out on the hillside, not at a trading post. So these beads are carried with them and they're used all over. At Fort Bridger, there are a variety of beads, and because of the fort burn, we at times get fractured and fragmented beads. We have found over 2,000 beads in excavation. At the location indicated on Albert Tracy's 1858 map, where I showed you where the beads came from. We found over 2,000 beads there, but some of them are Bridger's level, some of them are from the Latter-day Saint level. We think the Latter-day Saints trading post and Jim Bridger's trading post were close to one another, right on top of one another. This shows you the size of those beads. To find these beads in the screen takes forever. That's, you can see what the size difference is. These things here are almost microscopic. Now, I brag on archaeologists being able to find them, but I brag on the Native Americans who could thread those things. That's almost impossible for me to do. And I think about the patience, and they're not just using cloth. Now, remember what I told you about cotton? Cotton has a tendency to deteriorate, and if you get it wet. So you want to use either leather or silk. Well, they're not going to get that much silk thread. So they're using leather, and they're such excellent leather workers that they can take that leather. Now, some of it's organic, some of it's like a straw or something else like that that you make. But the leather that you're making that thread so thin and making it persevere and being able to run it through these beads is just incredible. And they had a high trade value. They had a high marketability. They would be traded. So people coming through Fort Bridger would buy the beaded items from the Native Americans and take them with them. And it was just a way of increasing industry at the site. This is the variability again of the beads. And we'll move on to something in a moment. This right here is from a game that Native Americans played. And so when the ceramic broke, you took and used it for whatever you wanted to. You could actually use a ceramic as a knife. You could use a glass as a knife. You could flake it and make it into an arrowhead. You could make it into a scraper. You didn't throw things away. I've worked in Mongolia for 10 years. And the one thing about Mongolia is you can't go to Costco or Walmart to get anything to get it fixed. So you learn to adjust and adapt and take whatever you've got there and make it into the tool that you need, whether it be a knife or whether it be a spoon or whether it be something to repair a car. We repaired this is taking you fast forward into the 21st century. We repaired a fuel pump with part of a milk jug that we cut, plastic milk jug that we cut and made it for well, I forget what they call it. It pulsates. It's the flat part that causes it to pump. So we made that we made that ourselves, even though I can't remember what it is. No, it'll come to me just a second. So these are the beads again, and we're moving on to something else. The red and whites are very tiny. Fort Bridger also offered services none more important than the blacksmith shop. Now, this is critical because among the things that we found in high numbers at this fort were iron. When Robinson sealed that, depending on which invoice you're looking at, he took 2 to 3 tons of iron. And remember, I told you that they burned the grass so that the Army wouldn't have that for use. They took the metal that they had, and they used it, they buried it in the ground so that the military could use the iron. So the iron was critical. They used it for everything from making knives. They made guns too. They actually made guns, they repaired guns. They did everything at this particular point, and they made knives. This is called the bladder for the fuel pump. I told you it'd come to me in a minute. So I'm sure you want to hear that right now when we're talking about blacksmith shops. The location of the 1857 blacksmith shops at Fort Bridger tell the story. This forge down here is one that was built when they repaired it. This is the Latter-day Saint blacksmith shop that they burned. This was repaired and reused in 57. And this is the military blacksmith shop built in 57. They were so important that among the first things they did was build these blacksmith shops. Now, I said there were four. The fourth one came with the artillery. The artillery had an accompanying blacksmith shop, and they were supposed to take 300 pounds of coal with them wherever they went. When the coal supply diminished, they would use coal from different sources. Jim Bridger began mining coal for his blacksmith shop in 1846. In 1846, he began mining coal, and he used it in the blacksmith shop. Because you could coke cottonwood and you could turn it into something that would burn hot enough, but not as good as coal. And you needed that high heat to be able to work with iron. The wagon rim shown here was found in excavation at one location, the 1857 blacksmith shop in the Latter-day Saints fortification. This is a freight wagon wheel. The only way you can bend this is to heat that up, but they wanted to make sure that they could use it. So they bent it and straightened it out and then buried it in a hole. And in addition to that, they buried other items of metal there so that the military couldn't have them for using making horseshoes and making repairs. Because the thing that you couldn't ship in great numbers, coal would be hard enough, is high amounts of iron. So iron was a high use commodity. So they buried it in the archaeological record. This is a satellite image of showing the location of the 1857 blacksmith shops again. And this is what the forge looked like. Now, the tools from the blacksmith shop were found all over, especially in excavation. Anvils are pretty important, and they would bury the anvil just like the other items, but anvils were extremely important, extremely heavy, but extremely important because of the fact that they were what you had to take and work with, what you had to take and hammer on. You could use a rock to hammer it, but you couldn't. You had to have the anvil, that hard thing to make the form on it. So the blacksmith shop in 1857 looked something like this. It was built out of logs. They had an entrance into it, and it was tore down fairly quickly. It was built the same way as the log officers' quarters were at Fort Bridger. In addition to finding these things, we also found things from 57 to 58. These are shoulder scales. Now, the infantry and the cavalry, the 2nd Dragoon, had these for shoulder scales. And what the purpose of these is that when you're on a horse, you have a sword, and that sword is used to decapacitate a person or cut their heads off. I hate to say that, but it's true. But the other thing that they do is they would strike down with a sword on the shoulder blade. And once this was severed, they couldn't use their arms. Once they severed the nerves and the muscles through here, they couldn't do it. So these shoulder scales were put not just for decoration on their uniform to protect them from being, from being cut at that particular point. We found these buried in place. So these are field drawings of the shoulder scales. This is how they fit on the uniform, and this is what they look like in full dress. The New York Times in 1857 showed these soldiers at Fort Bridger. The primary thing that they did was use Fort Bridger to house their ammunition, and the 2nd Dragoons, as they marched west, brought with them their goods. But in the winter of 1857 and 1858, so many of the animals had died, they pulled the wagons by pure muscle power. I don't know if any of you have ever been drafted. I was, and I can just see the military using human forces. But they actually did it. These are the lunettes that they built at the extension of it. And I'm showing this right here to show you. This is the Latter-day Saint structures. These are the buildings they built inside of it. This right here bothers me a little bit because this is the corral. And inside that corral, there were structures, and it shows us a wagon storage, and that's not right. And I'll show you in just a second something. This is what an infantryman showed of the way that the lunettes or the gun placements look like. This is what the military showed that they look like. In other words, there's what the engineers draw, there's what the soldiers build. And this is what it looked like. So this is a drawing in the winter of 1857 of the lunette. This photograph is taken in the fall of 1858 of what's left of the Mormon compound at this particular place right here. So you can see that 15-foot high walls. These are the 8-foot high walls right here. Right here, you see the main entrance. and you see the corral entrance, you see Native Americans sitting here, you see possible corn growing here, and there's a teepee off to the side. This is out looking out on the Latter-day Saint wall from inside the new barracks that are right there. And at this point, I've talked a lot, and I hope you have questions. Do you have questions that you'd like to ask?
What did they do with the beads? They were
What
little rocks. Like, is that how they made the beads, or was it glass or
glass? So they purchased them that way. They were made that way. So they were imported trade beads. Now, that's a good question. A lot of them made beads from like birds. So an eagle or sage grouse is a good thing to make a bead from. Yeah, from bones. They're hollow, so you just cut them in sections. And we found these actual beads made, these actual bead platforms where you see the sections cut across it, and then they cut it off and they snap it off, and then they run thread through it. So it's one of those things that's kind of
so rare in the state age to find an eagle bone necklace or whatnot.
It's not as rare as you think. We have a site where we found at least 30 of them. So, but those sites are
illegal because they're protected.
They belong to the federal government, and they belong to, if the tribe wants them, they can ask for them to be repatriated to the nation. So if the tribe wants them, then we repatriate them to them. We tell them if these have been found, and if they want them, then it's a process, but we repatriate them to the First Nation in most cases.
And, what's his name? Who had the powder?
Yeah.
Where did he originate from?
That's a good question. No, he wasn't LDS.
He wasn't.
No, he was a trapper. And so what happened is that when the Latter-day Saints purchased the property, there were still people that stayed there and traded, because that's how they made their money. So they didn't move out of Fort Bridger or the Bridger Valley. They stayed right there and continued to operate their trading operations. So he just sold it to the highest bidder. He sold it to the people who had the most money to pay for his black powder. Unfortunately for the Latter-day Saints, they were short of lead and they were short of powder. So to them, this was just one of the worst things that could happen at that point in time, was to lose that powder.
And then also with everything being territories.
Yes.
Past like what, the Mississippi River?
Yes.
How did Buchanan really have authority over it?
Total authority of it. So the president appoints, and it appoints the territorial government, and it's approved by Congress. Basically, it goes along party lines. So who the president appoints as the territorial governor is the person that's there. Brigham Young happened to be out there, and because of the fact that the people followed him, it was something that they continued for some period of time. So he was renewed from 1847 till 57. But because of three issues, one, judicial issues, where the judges, the federal judges weren't being accepted, the church judges were. But for good reason. A lot of times the federal judges would rule against the church, and and they weren't considered to be quite the best people that came there. A lot of times you would send your political rivals out to the territories to get them away from running against you in elections. It's kind of not much different than it is now, but in some ways it was considerably different. So they sent them out there to get them out of the way, because of the complaints by Jim Bridger of them taking his fort. Now, this is going until, as long as histories are written, you can buy a book that says Jim Bridger didn't sell his fort. You can buy a book that says Jim Bridger did sell his fort. As long as there will be histories written, it'll be argued. It'll never be something that's settled fact, because of the fact that there are 2 points of view. And part of it is the church paid $4,000 before. In 1853, they paid $4,000 after the fort was burned. So they burned the fort, the wooden buildings inside of the fort. They burned the fort, and they paid Jim Bridger and Vasquez $4,000 more. So that's the 8. In spoliation claim, because Bridger said that he was wrongfully cheated out of those buildings and 13 other buildings that were around, he was paid $6,000 by the federal government in about 1880. 1890s. It took that long to get to the court cases. But in the testimonies that we have from that, it is consistently said that there were 13 other buildings around Bridger's trading post. Bridger's land claim was through a Mexican land grant from Monterey. We're ruled here by Santa Fe. The people north of Colorado were ruled by Monterey. And that's because of the fact that the Spanish had a good idea of what their territories were like. And the hardest thing to cross in the West is the Colorado, because of the canyons. You know this because of where you live. So it's extremely hard. So administratively, everything to the southeast was ruled by Santa Fe. Everything to the west was ruled by Monterey. So he got a land grant 9 miles by 9 miles for that particular area, according to actually Latter-day Saint records. So I get that from Latter-day Saint records. I don't get that from Jim Bridger's records, though Jim Bridger's records say that he received a land grant from the governor of Alta California. Yes, Alta California, from Alta California.
So California was established, but it was still a territory too.
So up until 1848, so at the end of the Mexican-American War, then it becomes a territory. So it becomes California territory, and the gold's discovered in 48, 49. And you have this mass land rush. By 1850, they're a state. In fact, they're one of the quickest states to go from territory to statehood in the history of the United States, one of the fastest.